took my son to first-time mom school meet and greet, only to see his billionaire CEO father dropping his wife and her new child. Tricia tightened her grip on her son's small hand as they stepped out of the car. The parking lot buzzed with movement. Parents unloading backpacks, teachers waving, children bouncing with nervous excitement. But something inside her tightened without warning. Her breath stalled halfway in, like her body sensed a danger her mind hadn't named yet. She told herself she was tired. First days always came with nerves. Still, that explanation didn't settle the pressure creeping into her chest. Baxley squeezed her hand, grounding her. "Mom," he said softly, "why does my stomach feel funny?" She forced a smile and crouched to his level. "Because today matters. New things do that." She didn't know how true that was about to become. Baxley leaned into her side as they walked. His curls brushed her wrist, 5 years old and already trying to be brave, even as his fingers curled tighter around hers. "Will my teacher like me?" he asked. "She'll love you, Tricia," Tricia said without hesitation. He nodded, satisfied, then pointed toward the entrance where parents gathered. "There are a lot of people." "I'll stay right here," she assured him. "I'm not going anywhere." Her voice was steady, her body wasn't. A car rolled into the lot behind them. Not loud, not flashy, just deliberate. Tricia didn't turn at first. She didn't need to. The awareness came anyway, a subtle tightening between her shoulders, the kind she'd only felt once before, years ago, when a single presence could change the temperature of an entire room. Baxley stopped walking. His grip loosened. She felt it immediately. Baxley stared past her, eyes narrowing in thoughtful curiosity. "Mom," he said slowly, tugging her sleeve. "Yes, baby?" "That man." He tilted his head. "He looks like me." The parking lot noise faded. Her ears rang. Her heart hit hard once, then again, like it was testing its own strength. She turned. A man had stepped out of the car, tall, composed, movements controlled, like someone used to being watched. He adjusted his jacket, scanned the school entrance, and paused, just briefly, when his gaze swept across the lot. Tricia knew that posture, the way he stood before speaking, the way his jaw tightened when his thoughts moved faster than his words. She hadn't seen him in years. She'd still know him anywhere. Her throat closed. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, elegant and calm, handing him something carefully cradled, a small bundle, a child. Tricia's breath finally abandoned her. Her stomach dropped, sharp and sudden, but her feet stayed planted. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward. Baxley leaned closer to her leg. "Is he someone you know?" he whispered. She swallowed. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." The man turned. Their eyes met. Shock stripped the color from his face. For a brief moment the confidence slipped, replaced by disbelief so raw it nearly undid him. His gaze dropped, too quickly, too deliberately, to the child holding Tricia's hand. He looked back up at her. Disbelief gave way to understanding, and understanding hit like a blow. Tricia knelt beside Baxley, keeping her movements slow, controlled. "Hey," she said gently, "go find your classroom, okay? Remember how we practiced?" Baxley hesitated. His eyes flicked between her and the man again. "You're coming, right?" "In a minute," she said, pressing a kiss to his hair. "I promise." He nodded, trusting her completely, and walked toward the doors without looking back. She watched him until he was inside. Only then did she stand. The man took a step toward her, stopping just short of speaking. "Tricia," he said, voice lowered, uncertain. She met his gaze, calm on the surface, every nerve awake beneath it. "You recognized him," she said quietly. He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. Some truths don't disappear just because time passes. They wait. They surface when you least expect them, when children speak honestly, when silence no longer protects anyone. Tricia had spent years choosing peace. She hadn't come here for confrontation, explanations, or reopened wounds. But standing in that school parking lot, watching the man who had once walked away, now faced the life he never knew existed, she understood something clearly. Some moments ask you to be ready whether you are or not. And this was only the beginning. If you believe stories carry lessons worth passing on, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because this story may change how you see love, regret, and second chances. The alarm on Trisha's phone vibrated softly against the nightstand, a gentle hum rather than a sharp sound. She reached for it before it could wake Baxley, silencing it with practiced ease. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, pale and calm, settling over the small apartment like a quiet promise. For a moment, she stayed still, listening. Baxley's breathing came steady from the other room, deep and even. That sound alone eased something in her chest. Mornings were her favorite time, not because they were easy, but because they were theirs. She slipped out of bed and padded across the floor, careful not to let the loose board near the door creak. The apartment wasn't fancy, but it was clean, warm, and filled with things chosen carefully over time. A blue mug chipped at the rim, 2 pairs of shoes lined neatly by the door, one small, one worn down at the heel. She started the coffee, the scent rising slowly, familiar and grounding. This was how their days always began, quiet, intentional. Today just happened to be different. Baxley shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. He paused in the doorway, blinking at the sunlight that stretched across the floor. "Is today the day?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. Trisha smiled before turning around. "It is." He nodded solemnly, absorbing that, then climbed onto his chair at the table. "Do you think they have crayons?" "I'm sure they do," she said, sliding a bowl in front of him. "And markers. Probably stickers, too." His eyes widened. "The good kind?" She laughed quietly. "The very good kind." While he ate, he launched into a story about a dream he'd had. Something about a school with a slide instead of stairs and a teacher who let everyone wear socks on their hands. Trisha listened, genuinely listening, laughing at the right moments, asking questions that kept him talking. She loved this about him. His mind always busy, always curious, always reaching for something new. As she rinsed dishes in the sink, her thoughts drifted to the word first. First classroom, first teacher, first time sitting at a desk that wasn't their kitchen table. She'd watched every step leading here. First words, first steps, first scraped knees, and first apologies. She'd been there for all of it, always present, always enough. She rested her hands on the counter, letting that truth settle. Still, there was a tightness she couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, more like a question pressing gently at the edges of her thoughts. One she kept pushing aside because there was no space for it today. Today was about Baxley. "Mom," Baxley called from the hallway, voice irritated. "These buttons don't like me." She looked up to see him standing there in his neatly pressed shirt, tongue stuck out in concentration, fingers struggling with the middle button. "Ah," she said, walking over. "They've always been jealous of you." He looked up. "Why?" "Because you're faster than them," she said, kneeling in front of him. "And smarter." That earned a grin. She guided his hands, letting him try again before stepping in. The fabric was cool beneath her fingers, so small, too fast. "There," she said softly once the last button was done. "You did it." He puffed up his chest. "I told you." She tapped his nose gently. "You did." They shared a smile, the kind only shared through countless mornings like this. Rushed ones, tired ones, happy ones. As she helped him with his shoes, Trisha noticed how quiet he'd gone. "What's going on in that head?" she asked. Baxley shrugged. "Do I have to sit far away from you?" She paused, fingers tightening briefly around the laces. "No," she said carefully. "I'll be close." He seemed to relax at that. "Okay," but she stayed still a moment longer than necessary, staring at the knots she'd tied. There it was again, that faint unease. Not sharp enough to name, not loud enough to stop her, just there. Sunlight spilled across the living room as they moved toward the door. Dust motes floated lazily in the air. Baxley stopped to straighten a picture taped to the wall, a drawing of the two of them holding hands beneath a crooked sun. "Don't want it crooked," he said seriously. She watched him, heart swelling. Love, she'd learned, didn't always announce itself with big gestures. Most times it was moments like this. She grabbed her purse, checked for keys twice, and opened the door. Baxley stepped out first, eager, confident. She followed, locking it behind them. Halfway down the stairs, Baxley skipped ahead, then waited, looking back up at her. "You're coming, right?" She smiled. "I'm always coming." He accepted that without question and continued down. Trisha paused, one hand on the railing, the other resting over her chest. For just a second she closed her eyes. She didn't know why her heart beat a little faster than usual. or why the air felt slightly heavier than it had moments ago. She told herself it was nothing. First days did that. Change did that. She opened her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and followed her son into the morning. She had no way of knowing that this was the last moment of calm she'd had in years. But as the door closed behind them, that quiet question followed her out, waiting patiently for its moment. And that moment was closer than she realized. Before motherhood shaped the rhythm of her days, Tricia had measured time differently. Back then, mornings weren't about quiet breakfasts or pressed shirts. They were about deadlines, trains she almost missed, and notebooks filled with plans she believed she still had room to chase. She used to linger over mirrors, not out of vanity, but anticipation, wondering who she might become by the end of the day. She had lived alone then, in a much smaller space than the one she shared with Baxley now. Fewer things, fewer ties. Her apartment felt temporary, like a place meant only to hold her while she moved toward something larger. She slept with books stacked beside her bed and woke up already thinking 3 steps ahead. Responsibility hadn't scared her. It had energized her. She liked knowing effort led somewhere. That discipline mattered. She believed the right preparation could open any door. Looking back, she understood how much hope lived inside her then, how fully she trusted the future to be fair if she showed up prepared. Graduate school had sharpened that confidence. Long nights in quiet libraries, hands wrapped around cooling coffee cups, eyes straining as she chased clarity through research papers and late revisions. She didn't complain. She didn't need to. Every finished project felt like proof that she belonged in rooms she hadn't yet entered. Her professors noticed her focus. Classmates asked for her notes. She had learned to speak carefully but with conviction, never louder than necessary. When she received her final acceptance letters and internship offers, she laid them out on her desk, studying each logo like it carried instructions for her future. The Damore Group felt unreal at first, a name spoken with a kind of respect that bordered on caution. It represented influence, ambition scaled larger than she'd ever known. Accepting that offer felt like stepping onto a moving platform, risky, exhilarating. She told herself she was ready. Walking into the Damore Group headquarters for the first time, Tricia became aware of every detail about herself, her posture, her clothing, the cadence of her steps against polished floors. Everyone seemed purposeful, moving as if pulled by invisible threads. She wasn't intimidated exactly, but she was alert, observing, learning where to stand, when to speak, when silence carried more weight. Most of the people around her had been trained for this environment since birth. Tricia hadn't. She carried her background with quiet pride, but she could feel the difference. Still, she worked harder than expected of her. She stayed late, asked thoughtful questions, watched how influence moved through rooms not by volume, but by attention. She became good at reading when conversations shifted, when decisions had already been made without needing to be announced. She learned quickly where she fit and where she didn't. The contrast inside the company was impossible to miss. Power lived there, visible in small details, the way assistants anticipated needs before they were spoken, the way meetings ended with certainty rather than discussion. But humility wasn't currency, confidence was. Tricia noticed how often voices competed, how pauses were rare, how ideas sometimes mattered less than where they came from. She adjusted without losing herself, holding onto her calm while navigating expectations that seemed designed for people accustomed to being followed. She didn't chase attention. She earned it quietly, and that, more than anything else, made her stand out. She noticed him long before he spoke to her. Not because he announced himself, he didn't, but because conversations shifted when he entered rooms. People straightened, chairs aligned, heads turned not eagerly, but instinctively. His presence moved with intention, measured and controlled. He watched everything, not in a way that felt intrusive, but alert, processing. When he spoke, it was after listening long enough to understand where each voice landed. She told herself not to stare. She failed. Board meetings weren't meant for interns, but Tricia found reasons to be present, organizing documents, taking notes, picking up on nuance most people rushed past. She noticed the way he tapped his pen when thinking, the slight tilt of his head when considering an answer he didn't fully agree with. Once, during a pause in discussion, His gaze lifted unexpectedly and met hers across the table. Just for a second, no smile, no acknowledgement, but he'd seen her. Her pulse quickened, not romantically, but with recognition. Being noticed like that felt different than praise. It felt like evaluation. She didn't look away. Their interaction stayed brief at first, a nod in passing, a shared elevator ride marked by silence that felt deliberate, not awkward. Once he stopped beside her desk after a long meeting, eyes scanning the notes she'd compiled. "You caught something they missed," he said simply, tapping a margin. She swallowed, steadying herself. It felt important. He nodded once. That was all. He walked away without another word. But that night, as she shut down her computer and stepped into the quiet hallway, Tricia realized something had shifted. Not externally, internally. She was no longer just observing the world she wanted to enter. She'd been seen standing inside it, and he had noticed. It started with coffee, not intention. Lee didn't ask her out. He didn't frame it as anything personal. One afternoon, after a long meeting that stretched far past daylight, he stopped beside her desk and asked if she wanted to grab a cup before heading home. His tone was neutral, almost casual, as if he were asking about weather. She nearly said no out of habit. They walked 2 blocks to a quiet cafe she liked, one she'd never mentioned at work. That surprised her. He ordered simply, no extra requests, no show of preference. They sat facing the window, shoulders angled slightly apart, conversation circling safe topics, workload, upcoming projects, books they'd both read. He listened closely, didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill silence. When they parted, there was no lingering, no implication, just a quiet sense that something had shifted by a fraction. Coffee became occasional, then expected. Dinners followed naturally, as if they were continuing conversations already in progress. Sometimes takeout eaten at her small table, sometimes a quiet place chosen because it allowed them to speak without raising their voices. He never led with status or talked about numbers. When she asked about his day, he answered honestly but sparingly, careful not to dominate space. They talked about childhood, routines, favorite seasons, the value of consistency, about work as effort rather than achievement, about what felt meaningful when no one was watching. She noticed how comfortable she felt around him, how she didn't measure her words or polish her thoughts. That mattered more than she realized at first. There was no grand declaration, just familiarity growing warmer. Walks came last. They happened without planning. After dinner, after late evenings when neither wanted to return immediately to separate lives. City streets quieted at night, lights softening as traffic thinned. They walked side by side, hands not touching, steps naturally matching pace. It was during those walks that she began to understand him beyond his role. He spoke about pressure in abstract terms, never complaining, but never pretending it didn't exist. Expectations layered so densely they left little room for missteps. With her, he didn't perform ease. He allowed himself to pause. She realized she was learning him slowly, intentionally, without rush, and that he was doing the same. They didn't bond over luxury. If anything, he seemed relieved by its absence. He noticed small things instead, the way she always carried a pen, the order she stacked papers, how she remembered details most people overlooked. She admired his discipline, but more than that, his consistency. His values aligned quietly with hers. Effort mattered. Words needed to mean something. Promises weren't ornamental. They never spoke the word love aloud. It didn't need language yet, but she felt it forming, steady and deliberate. One evening changed how she saw him. They were sitting on her couch, shoes kicked off, conversation drifting. He grew quiet mid-sentence, staring toward nothing in particular. She didn't interrupt, just waited. "There's a version of me people expect," he finally said. "Sometimes I forget where it ends." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was honest. That was when she saw the separation between his public certainty and his private weight. How often he guarded himself. How rarely he admitted uncertainty. She believed him because there was no performance in that moment. Just truth, offered calmly. The secrecy crept in subtly. Not discussed up front, but understood. Late dinners entered the calendar under vague labels. Conversations at work remained measured. They didn't touch in hallways. They didn't linger too long after meetings. Tricia accepted it without protest, believing discretion was temporary, necessary. He never asked her to disappear, only to be careful. And she trusted that care would ease with time. Career pressure pressed differently against him as his responsibilities grew. Promotions, oversight, visibility. The higher he went, the more space he had to protect. She told herself patience was a form of belief, but futures have their own gravity. His path pulled forward, upward, defined by expectations beyond either of them. Hers remained grounded in individual effort, personal alignment, choosing meaning over momentum. Neither was wrong. They were simply moving along lines that angled away from one another. She felt it before she could name it. In the pauses that grew slightly longer, in conversations rerouted, in plans framed vaguely rather than concretely. Still, when he looked at her, when he showed up, when he spoke quietly and meant what he said, she believed him. Not because he promised permanence, but because in those moments he was present. And for a while that felt like enough. Tricia didn't plan the moment. She didn't rehearse it in a mirror or choose the perfect words. The truth pressed against her ribcage for days before she finally spoke, making sleep shallow and mornings heavy. She moved through routine on instinct alone, waiting for a pause that felt steady enough to hold something fragile. It came one evening when the city outside her apartment had grown quiet. Lee sat across from her at the small table, jacket draped over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled as though he intended to stay a while. They'd been talking about nothing in particular, work, an upcoming project, a detail neither would remember later. She set her glass down carefully, fingers resting against the rim longer than necessary. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He looked up at once, attentive, present. That was part of what made this harder. She didn't soften it. She didn't circle around it. She had learned that honesty, delivered cleanly, hurt less in the long run. "I'm pregnant." For a fraction of a second his expression didn't change, then his breath stopped. His eyes dropped to the table, not avoiding her, processing. She watched emotion move across him in quiet stages, surprise, calculation, something like fear restrained by discipline. He sat back slowly, one hand dragging across his face. "I need time," he said at last. The words weren't cruel, they weren't loud, they were measured, careful, and somehow heavier than anger would have been. She nodded once. Okay, that was all she said, because there was nothing else to add that wouldn't weaken the truth she'd just placed between them. Lee didn't leave that night angry or dismissive. In some ways, that hurt more. He stayed a little while longer, speaking carefully, as if sound itself required permission. He didn't promise anything. He didn't ask her to decide anything either. Time followed, but not the kind that heals. Messages grew shorter. Replies came later. Meetings that once found reasons to overlap now ended cleanly. When they spoke, their conversations felt guarded, as though both were searching for footing they no longer shared. Tricia noticed first in the silences, spaces where certainty used to live. He didn't withdraw abruptly. He gradually stepped back, each movement small enough to defend as reasonable. She didn't chase him. It wasn't pride. It was clarity forming quietly, piece by piece. She recognized the shift for what it was, not confusion, not cruelty, but choice being postponed until it became something else entirely. She went to her appointments alone. She listened to doctors explain changes without interrupting. At home, she placed her hand over her stomach and spoke softly, grounding herself in what was real and present. She carried disappointment without dramatizing it, let it settle instead of spilling over. Weeks passed, then months. Lee wasn't gone, not entirely, but he wasn't coming close either. Conversations stayed polite, distant, the careful kind people use once they sense consequence. She stopped telling him details, not out of resentment, but because she could feel which truths had no safe place to land anymore. One evening, she stood alone in her kitchen holding a cup of tea, looking out at the city she once believed held endless possibility. She realized she wasn't waiting anymore. Something inside her had shifted into resolve. She made her decision quietly. There would be no demands, No public scenes, no attempts to force alignment where none existed. She would choose stability over conflict, peace over uncertainty. She packed up her apartment a few weeks later, sent polite notices, accepted a position that required distance, not escape, just space. She carried her life forward deliberately, without bitterness. She didn't tell Lee she was leaving. By the time she might have, it felt unnecessary. The headlines came later. She saw them by accident, scrolling one evening, thumb moving out of habit more than curiosity. His name filled the screen, framed by language that celebrated progress and alliances. A photograph accompanied it, composed, polished, purposeful. Lee D'Amour marries prominent socialite. Tricia stared at the words until they lost shape. There it was, the choice, completed without discussion, not addressed to her, not explained. She felt no jealousy, no anger, just a sudden clean ache, sharp with clarity. The future she'd believed in had been replaced by one that didn't include her, and the confirmation arrived without ceremony. She closed the article and set her phone down. That night, she sat at the edge of her bed, one hand resting where new life stirred, and breathed through the disappointment until it softened into resolve. She allowed herself grief without letting it define her. By morning, she knew exactly what she would do. She would build a life that didn't rely on what had been withheld, and she would do it with steadiness, dignity, and care. No headlines required. Leaving the city didn't happen in a rush. Tricia didn't pack overnight or vanish between sunsets. She took her time, finishing commitments, closing doors with care instead of force. She wanted her exit to match the way she'd lived there, deliberate, quiet, without spectacle. She sold more than she carried. Let go of furniture she'd once thought essential. Gave books away to people who would read them instead of storing them for a future that no longer felt certain. Each choice lightened something inside her. On her last night, she stood by the window of her apartment and watched the city move the way it always had, busy, confident, indifferent. She felt no bitterness toward it, just distance. She wasn't running from anything. She was moving toward calm. Pregnancy changed the rhythm of her days in ways no meeting or deadline ever had. There was no one to sit beside her during appointments, no hand to squeeze when reality pressed in. And yet, she never felt abandoned by her own decision. She learned her body again, listened instead of pushing, adjusted expectations, learned patience with herself where she used to demand performance. Some nights were long. Some mornings came too quickly. She spoke to the life growing inside her while making simple meals, while folding laundry, while standing at the window waiting for a calm she knew would come eventually. There was strength in routine, comfort in repetition. She wasn't lonely in the way people often imagined. She was occupied, with care, with intention, with love building itself quietly from the inside out. Baxley arrived early in the morning, when the world was still dim and quiet. The room was calm. Her body worked through the moment with resolve rather than fear. When she finally heard his cry, thin but determined, something inside her settled permanently. They placed him against her chest, warm and new, his tiny fingers curling instinctively. Tears came then, not from pain, but relief. She'd done this. She was here. He was safe. She memorized him in those first hours, the shape of his nose, the sound of his breathing, how he stilled the moment she spoke. She didn't feel lack. She felt arrival. There were opportunities she didn't pursue, messages she chose not to return, information she left undisclosed on purpose. She knew what acknowledgement could offer: support, recognition, material ease. She also knew the cost. Money would have complicated peace. Recognition would have required explanation. She refused to build her child's life around a narrative shaped by absence and negotiation, so she chose anonymity, chose work that paid steadily without demanding the spotlight, chose mornings that began gently and nights that closed without regret. It wasn't sacrifice. It was alignment. Years later, when the weight of those choices often went unseen, Tricia never questioned them. She'd chosen stability not because it was easy, but because it lasted. If you've ever chosen peace over revenge or silence over chaos, let me know in the comments. Your story might help someone else. She believed that. Some choices didn't announce themselves loudly. Some strength lived quietly, carried forward one steady day at a time, and that was something she was proud to have given her son. The school grounds hummed with life. Parents clustered near the entrance. coffee cups in hand, voices overlapping in easy conversation. Children darted between adults, shoes scuffing pavement, laughter cutting through the air. Teachers stood by open doors, greeting families with practiced warmth, clipboards tucked under their arms. It looked like every other first day. Tricia moved through it carrying a stillness that didn't match the noise around her. Her steps were measured, her expression calm. Inside, something churned, not panic, not fear, but a restless awareness she couldn't quiet. She checked the name printed on the classroom door twice, even though she already knew it. Watched Baxley scan the room with open curiosity. He tugged on her sleeve, pointing out bright posters, low shelves filled with supplies, a corner rug shaped like a circle of smiling animals. "This one's mine?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. But her attention drifted, not outward, never outward, but inward, where memory and instinct pressed against one another. The feeling had followed her since morning, a sense of timing out of alignment, of something arriving before she was prepared to receive it. She placed her hand flat against Baxley's back, grounding herself in the rise and fall of his breath. Whatever this was, she told herself, she could handle it. She always did. The sound came from behind them, not the screech of tires or the slam of a door, just the muted roll of a car easing into place, deliberate and unhurried. The kind of sound that didn't ask for attention, but took it anyway. Tricia's shoulders tightened before she turned. Her body responded faster than thought, muscles adjusting, breath pausing mid-cycle. She didn't know why. She turned slowly. The vehicle sat near the curb like it belonged there, dark and understated. The engine quieted, a door opened. Time didn't stop, it narrowed. The crowd kept moving. A teacher waved, a child dropped a backpack. Patricia's focus tunneled, zeroing in on the figure stepping onto the pavement. Tall, precise, familiar in a way that bypassed logic. Her pulse thudded once hard. She saw the woman first, poised, composed, a presence that suggested certainty. She stood close to the car, adjusting her grip on something she cradled carefully before bending to lift it fully into view. A small carrier, a child. Tricia's chest tightened, not sharply but steadily, as if the truth were unfolding inch by inch rather than striking all at once. She felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders, heavier than she expected. This wasn't a past moment colliding with the present. This was proof. Living, breathing proof that choices had continued being made long after she'd stepped away. The man rounded the car then, confident posture intact, tie set neatly against his collar, movements effortless. He reached for the child without hesitation, fingers sure, practiced. He hadn't lost time everywhere. Tricia stood very still. Baxley shifted beside her. She felt it before she heard it, the slight tug at her sleeve, the pause in his movement. The way his body leaned forward, attention captured by something he couldn't articulate yet. "Mom," he said. She turned to him, heart steady despite everything pressing in. "Yes, baby?" He stared openly now, eyes moving between her and the man a short distance away. Something clicked in his expression, not confusion but recognition, the uncomplicated kind only children have. "That man looks like me." The words landed cleanly. No accusation, no drama, just observation. Tricia's breath left her slowly. Around them, the schoolyard continued its motion, unaware that anything had shifted. The man across the lot turned at that moment, gaze lifting instinctively. Their eyes met. His face drained of color, and in that instant, she knew, without doubt, without explanation, that the past she had kept contained had found its way into the present. Nothing about this moment could be taken back. Nothing could be softened. Everything was about to change. Lee didn't need confirmation. The moment his eyes locked onto Tricia, recognition moved through him without resistance. It wasn't gradual. It didn't require context. It was immediate, absolute, and disruptive in a way leadership experience couldn't shield him from. For years, he had compartmentalized memory with discipline, faces archived, moments categorized, emotions kept in check. But none of that mattered here. This wasn't a recollection. This was presence. Her posture hadn't changed. She stood exactly as she always had, balanced, deliberate, unhidden. The crowd around them might as well not have existed. He noticed the familiar slope of her shoulders, the way her gaze held steady rather than searching. His thoughts scrambled for something logical to grip. Time compressed. His eyes dropped despite effort. The boy, brown curls catching the light, a stance that mirrored his own without knowing why. That connection struck harder than recognition ever could. Lee inhaled slowly, trying to maintain control, but something vital slipped, not externally. No one would notice, but internally, where everything he'd postponed now demanded response. He took a step forward without realizing it. Trisha didn't move. She met his gaze with composure earned through years of choosing calm over reaction. Trisha didn't feel startled. The shock had already passed through her before recognition reached him. What remained was steadiness, quiet, grounded, practiced. She had faced this moment in fragments before, imagined it during restless nights. Never like this, but close enough that she wasn't undone by it. She saw the strain flicker across his face, the calculation, the understanding settling into place piece by piece. She neither softened nor hardened. She simply existed as she was. This wasn't confrontation to her. It was convergence. She had carried truth alone long enough to know it didn't need force to stand. Baxley shifted again, sensing the weight in the space. His fingers curled briefly around Trisha's sleeve, eyes flicking between her and the man who had stopped moving entirely. She knelt beside him at once. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice unchanged. "Remember what we talked about?" He nodded, though his expression held hesitation. "I want you to go inside and look for the big blue rug. The teacher said that's where everyone starts. You're coming?" he asked, voice low but sure. "In just a minute," she replied, smoothing his hair. "I'm right here." He studied her face, searching for something he trusted more than explanations. Whatever he found there satisfied him. He turned and walked toward the door, small backpack shifting against his shoulders, steps unhurried. Trisha watched until he disappeared into the building. Only then did she stand. Lee's wife approached, confusion evident but controlled. She had noticed the shift. Anyone attentive would have, but not its meaning. "Is everything okay?" she asked him softly, eyes scanning Trisha briefly before returning to her husband. Lee didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed where Baxley had gone. His grip on the carrier tightened just slightly. "We missed drop-off time," he said, avoiding the question without meaning to. She followed his line of sight back to Trisha, then again to the doorway. "You know her?" she asked carefully. Lee finally turned. "Yes," he said. The word carried more weight than explanation ever could. Trisha didn't interrupt. She didn't correct or clarify. She allowed the space to stretch, letting truth exist without rushing it into form. Because some truths don't need introduction. They make themselves known, through tension, through resemblance, through moments that refuse to stay quiet. And in that space between what had been hidden and what now stood visible, there was no retreat left for anyone involved. They didn't talk there in the open, with parents glancing over and children running past. Trisha broke eye contact first, not out of avoidance but practicality. "This isn't the place," she said quietly. Lee nodded once, as if grateful she'd spoken for both of them. His wife shifted beside him, sensing more than understanding. "I'll take her in," his wife offered, reaching for the carrier. She looked at Trisha again, curiosity softened by courtesy. "It was nice to meet you." Trisha gave a small nod. "You too." Lee's fingers lingered on the handle of the carrier for a second longer than necessary before he let go. His wife walked toward the entrance, glancing back only once. The baby made a small sound, unaware of the storm circling just beyond the doors. When they were alone, truly alone in the crowded lot, Trisha spoke. "There's a side entrance near the staff parking," she said. "It's quieter." He followed without argument. They walked in silence around the building, shoes crunching lightly over gravel. A breeze moved through the narrow passage, cooler here, away from the warm cluster of families. Trisha stopped beside a plain metal door and turned to face him. She didn't waste time. "You have a son," she said. The words were steady, neither accusing nor softened. Just true. Lee closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing for impact he'd already felt. "I know," he said, voice low. I didn't. Not really. But when I saw him..." He trailed off, searching for footing. Trisha didn't fill the silence. The words had been spoken. They didn't need decoration. He swallowed. How old is he? 5, she said. Started school today. Something in his expression twisted. I missed all of it, he said quietly. Most of it, she corrected. Not all. If you want to be accurate, you missed the years you chose to be far away. The rest, that depends on what you do now. There was no anger in her tone. That seemed to unsettle him more than rage would have. Regret showed up strangely on Lee's face. He didn't break down or apologize in grand phrases. His training wouldn't allow that. Control was muscle deep by now. But the small signs were obvious if you knew where to look. His hands wouldn't stay still. His gaze bounced between her and the ground, never wandering far but unable to settle. When he spoke, the pauses between words stretched. I should have asked more, he said. When you told me you were pregnant, I convinced myself you would reach out again if you needed me. I told myself you had made a choice. You believed the story that cost you the least, she replied. That's what people do when they don't want to move. He didn't argue. I thought about you, he said, more than I admitted. Then life shifted. I pushed it down, told myself it was better to let you live your life without interference. That sounds thoughtful, she said, until you remember there was a child involved. The words weren't cruel. They were precise. He flinched anyway. You're right, he said. There isn't a version where I'm not responsible. I could have called. I could have followed up. I chose not to. He looked up then, and she saw it clearly. Regret. Unguarded. Not performative. Just there. I don't expect you to care about how difficult my life was then, he continued. The pressure, the board, the marriage arrangement. None of that excuses what I failed to do. I know that. Tricia watched him for a long moment. It matters that you know it, she said. But knowing isn't the same as fixing. I can't fix it, he admitted. No, she agreed. You can't. The admission hung between them, heavy but honest. Tricia's boundaries had been built over years, not out of spite, but self-preservation. She didn't need to rehearse them. They were part of her now. So, she said, folding her arms lightly, not defensive, simply containing herself. Let's be clear about a few things. Lee nodded, bracing. First, she began, you don't get to rewrite history because you regret it. You weren't tricked, kept in the dark, or pushed away. You walked away. You chose distance. Whatever you decide to do now has to start there. I understand, he said. Second, she continued, Baxley is not a problem to fix or a box to check. He's a person. You don't get to show up with gifts and expect affection as a return on investment. His jaw tightened. I wouldn't. You might not mean to, she cut in gently, but this is the first time you're facing this. I've had years to think about it. So listen, please. He fell quiet. Third, she said, voice softening only slightly, my life does not become an open door because you're ready now. I've built something stable for him, for me. I won't let anyone come in and shake that just because they feel guilty. He swallowed, eyes dropping briefly. So what does that leave? He asked softly. Possibility, she answered. Slow, consistent, earned. Not rushed. Not public. Not about your image. About him. And you? He asked, almost reluctantly. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for anything, she said. I'm not interested in your money. I don't want headlines. I don't need apologies repeated until they lose meaning. I want respect. I want honesty. I want him protected from adult mistakes. She paused. And I want every choice from here on to be made with his heart in mind, not yours and not mine. Lee absorbed her words in silence, the way he used to absorb data in boardrooms. Except this time, nothing about his posture looked detached. How do I do that? He asked finally. The question was quiet, stripped of the certainty people usually expected from him. There was no strategy in it. Just a man standing in the echo of his own decisions, asking for direction in terrain he'd avoided for too long. How do I do this right? He added, or as close to right as possible, given how wrong it started. Tricia exhaled slowly. You start small, she said. You don't come in claiming titles. You don't introduce yourself as his father on day one. You get to know him as a person first, a friend, someone reliable. Kids understand actions more than words. He listened, every line of his face focused. You show up when you say you will, she continued. No grand gestures, no impossible promises. You let him ask questions at his pace. You answer them honestly without turning our history into a battle story. And you, he asked again, softer. I'll be there, she said, watching, setting limits, pulling back if this starts to feel like a performance or a convenience. But I won't block him from something that could be good for him just because it hurts to remember how we got here. He nodded slowly. Will you give me a chance? He asked. I'll give him the chance to decide, she replied. That's the difference. He seemed to accept that. From inside the building, faint laughter filtered through the door, children's voices rising and falling. Both of them turned toward the sound without thinking. This is his first day, she said. That's what today is supposed to be about, not us, not the past. I know, Lee said, but I'm grateful I saw him, even like this. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. Tricia studied him, searching for the man she'd known, the one she'd loved and the one who had failed her, all residing in the same face. Then prove it, she said gently. Not to me, to him, over time. He nodded once, slowly, as if sealing something with himself. There was no echo, no dramatic shift in the world around them. Just two people standing near a quiet school entrance, acknowledging a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Whatever came next would not erase what had been done, but it could decide who they chose to be from here on. Lee didn't try to insert himself into Baxley's life all at once. He didn't arrive with explanations, labels, or claims. When Tricia agreed to let him come by the park one Saturday morning, he showed up 10 minutes early and waited across the path until she nodded. That detail didn't go unnoticed. He kept his hands visible, his posture open. He spoke to Baxley the way one speaks to someone whose trust hasn't been requested yet, slowly, lightly, without expectation. He asked about school, about favorite cartoons, about why dinosaurs were still interesting even though everyone already knew they were gone. When Baxley shrugged or gave short answers, Lee didn't push. He stayed anyway, sat on the bench, tossed pebbles into the dirt, let time pass without filling it. He learned quickly that access wasn't something you asked for. It was something you were granted in increments, earned through consistency rather than explanation. So he came back the next weekend, and the one after that. Baxley noticed before acknowledging it. At first, Lee existed as a recurring fixture, someone who listened more than he spoke, who remembered small details without pointing them out. Someone who didn't disappear when attention drifted elsewhere. One afternoon, Baxley brought a toy truck to the park and without thinking, pushed it toward Lee. It wasn't an invitation disguised as generosity. It was instinct. Want to see? Baxley asked. Lee smiled, careful not to appear too eager. Sure. They crouched side by side, wheels tracing lines in the dirt. Baxley narrated rules no one had ever written down. Lee followed them without question. Over time, questions came. Simple at first. Why do you wear that watch? How come you walk fast? Do you like peanut butter? Lee answered honestly, without shaping himself into something impressive. He was patient with moments where Baxley pulled away. He didn't chase affection. He allowed it to arrive on its own terms. Warmth grew gradually, steady, unforced. Tricia watched everything without interfering. She noticed when Lee remembered to bring a jacket because Baxley always forgot his. When he showed up, whether Baxley was excited or distant. When disappointment didn't send him retreating. She noted how Lee accepted correction without defensiveness, how he asked before adjusting routines, how he never spoke poorly of her choices or the past. Not once did he pressure her to move faster or soften boundaries. That mattered. She felt no urgency to intervene, no temptation to rewrite history. Her role remained what it had always been: protector, observer, anchor. If something didn't feel right, she would step in. Until then, she allowed the process to unfold. Trust, she knew, grew best when watched quietly. Some evenings after Baxley fell asleep, she sat alone and considered how different this felt from the fear she'd once imagined. There were no dramatic gestures, no promises made under pressure, just effort repeated consistently. That was the difference. Growth doesn't announce itself. One day, Baxley ran ahead to the swings without checking back. Another day, he asked if Lee could stay longer. Another day, he waved goodbye without hesitation, confident the presence wouldn't vanish. That was how showing up worked. Not spectacular, not immediate. If this story is resonating, Share it with someone who believes second chances should be earned, not given, because redemption doesn't come from words. It comes from returning again and again, even when there's nothing to gain except trust that takes time to form. And for the first time in a long while, Tricia allowed herself to believe that time, handled carefully, could still build something worth keeping. The conversation happened late, long after Baxley had fallen asleep. The apartment was quiet in the way that only comes after a full day, dishes drying in the rack, lights dimmed low enough to soften everything they touched. Tricia sat at the small table, a mug warming her hands more for comfort than temperature. Lee sat across from her, jacket folded neatly beside his chair. He hadn't assumed the couch. He hadn't crossed into familiar space without invitation. There was an awareness to his presence that hadn't existed years ago, an understanding that comfort was no longer his to claim by default. They didn't start with apologies. They talked about Baxley's day, about how he'd asked 3 questions in under a minute, about how seriously he took choosing cereal. Small things, real things, the kind that tied a child to the present moment instead of the past. He likes routine, Tricia said. It makes him feel safe. I've noticed, Lee replied. He checks the schedule more than I do. She smiled faintly at that. Silence followed, not awkward, just unhurried. The city outside hummed distantly. Lee leaned back slightly, exhaling as though releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. I don't expect anything from you, he said finally. I want you to know that... Tricia met his gaze, waiting. I know I lost the right to hope for certain things, he continued, but I needed to say that I see you, what you built, what you carried alone. She didn't dismiss that. She didn't embrace it either. She let it land. Love isn't what people say when it feels good, Tricia said after a moment. It's what they do when it's uncomfortable. He nodded slowly. Love is showing up, she continued. Not once, not when you're inspired, but when there's nothing to gain, when it costs time, patience, restraint. She held his eyes without accusation. I loved you once because you were sincere, she said. I stopped because sincerity without presence isn't enough. Lee absorbed that in silence. I'm not asking you to return anything, she added. I don't measure this in fairness. I measure it in impact, on him, on our stability. I'm not looking for shortcuts, he said quietly. I don't want a role I haven't earned. She studied him, the posture, the way he waited instead of pressing, the absence of urgency. That's new, she said. I've learned, he replied, late, but honestly. She tilted her head slightly. Learning only matters if it changes how you act. It already has, he said, not defensively, just sure. What followed wasn't a reunion. There were no declarations made in the quiet of that room, no promise of a shared future spoken into existence. Instead, there were more evenings like this one, conversations that stretched without pressure, trust rebuilding through repetition rather than words, a hand resting near hers without reaching, space respected, time allowed to do its work. Sometimes Lee stayed late enough to wash a dish. Sometimes he left early when Baxley's schedule demanded quiet. Sometimes weeks passed without anything shifting at all, and that was fine. Love changed shape, not as a return but as something new, built with awareness rather than assumption. It was slower, quieter, rooted in growth instead of longing. Tricia didn't wonder anymore whether love could survive disappointment. She was learning something better. Love could be redefined, not as a feeling reclaimed, but as a responsibility upheld, patiently, deliberately, and without demand. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The change in Baxley came quietly, the way most meaningful shifts do. There was no single moment Tricia could point to and say, that's when he felt safe. It showed in 1,000 small ways instead. He slept through the night more often, not rigidly, not perfectly, but with the ease of a child who trusted that morning would come and someone would be there waiting. He stopped asking so many questions before bed, stopped checking the door twice. When he talked about his day, his sentences stretched longer, filled with detail instead of pauses. One afternoon, Tricia stood at the sink while Baxley played in the living room. Lee had stopped by earlier and left an hour ago as he always did, on time, without lingering. Tricia heard Baxley narrating quietly to himself, lining up toy cars along the baseboard. This one stays, he said softly, pushing one forward. This one goes to work, but he comes back. Trisha closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Security wasn't about presence alone. It was about pattern, about knowing what happened next without fear. Baxley didn't need explanations or labels. His body already understood what his words hadn't learned yet. That realization settled something deep inside her. Trisha's peace didn't arrive as relief. It came as acceptance. She no longer rehearsed conversations in her head before bedtime, no longer scanned moments for warning signs. The tension she once carried, the constant readiness for disruption, eased its grip gradually as trust built itself through predictability. She noticed the difference most when she was alone. Mornings felt softer, decisions felt clearer, her thoughts returned to her instead of circling what-ifs. She gained space again, the kind that allowed her to enjoy the present without guarding it. One evening, after Baxley had fallen asleep, she sat by the window and watched lights flicker on across nearby buildings. The city hummed distantly, unchanged. She felt no pull toward what she'd left behind, no urge to rewrite any part of her story. Everything she needed was here. She had chosen this life deliberately, every step, every refusal, every boundary held. And now, watching it settle into something steady, she felt proud without needing reassurance. Peace, she realized, wasn't the absence of hardship. It was the confidence that whatever came next could be met without losing herself. She had built that. Lee changed too, though he never spoke it aloud. The humility showed in what he stopped doing. He no longer tried to anticipate outcomes or manage perceptions. He listened more than he planned. When he spoke, it was with care, not confidence. He asked permission where he once would have assumed welcome. There were moments Trisha caught him watching Baxley with an expression that wasn't regret, something calmer, heavier, responsibility carried without performance. He never corrected Baxley when he misspoke about timing or roles, never rushed explanations. When Baxley asked questions, Lee answered simply. When he didn't, Lee waited. One afternoon, Baxley made a card with uneven handwriting and handed it to him without ceremony. Lee accepted it like something sacred, holding it carefully, folding it once, then tucking it into his jacket pocket instead of reading it right away. Trisha saw his throat tighten. Nothing needed to be said. Humility, she learned, wasn't about lowering oneself. It was about standing in truth without retreat or defense. Lee stood there now, not absolved, not celebrated, but present. And that was enough. The past didn't lose its meaning. It simply stopped shaping the future. Everything had come full circle, not by returning to what once was, but by allowing what was to become something honest, grounded, and complete. Peace doesn't arrive by accident. It's chosen, again and again, in moments when resentment would be easier. Trisha's life didn't unfold without pain, disappointment, or detours, but every time she faced a fork in the road, she weighed what would keep her steady instead of what would feel justified in the moment. She learned that holding on to anger required constant energy, while letting go created room to breathe. Peace wasn't passive or weak. It was active. It required restraint, clarity, and the courage to move forward without dragging the past along for proof. Second chances, she discovered, were never something to demand. They weren't owed because time had passed or apologies had been offered. They were something earned the slow way, through showing up when it's inconvenient, through consistency when no one is watching, through humility that doesn't ask to be praised. Lee didn't step back into their lives as a rescue or a reward. He earned space by respecting limits and honoring trust at a pace set by the people he had once left behind. Redemption came not through words, but through repeated effort. Children, above all else, need consistency. Not perfection, not grand gestures, just reliability they can feel in their bodies. Baxley didn't need a flawless story or adults who never made mistakes. He needed people who arrived when they said they would, who told the truth without burdening him, who created patterns he could lean on. Stability wasn't built from dramatic moments. It came from routines kept, promises honored, and the quiet assurance that love wouldn't vanish without warning. There's a kind of success the world applauds, titles, wealth, influence, and then there's the kind that doesn't make headlines. Trisha saw both up close. She understood how easy it was to chase recognition and how empty it could feel when it cost connection. Achievement without love offered no warmth to rest in at the end of the day. It was only when success aligned with care, responsibility, and presence that it held real meaning. Anything else was just noise. Every choice in this story hinged on one simple truth: the lives we touch matter more than the image we maintain. You don't measure a good life by how impressive it looks from the outside, but by how safe it feels on the inside, especially to the people who depend on you. Peace, love, and responsibility don't arrive all at once. They're built quietly, over time, through decisions that don't always look dramatic, but shape everything that follows. If this story moved you, if it made you pause or reflect, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that growth is possible, that mistakes don't have to define the ending, and that choosing carefully can change more than just one life. And before you go, leave a comment. What would you have done differently?